Welcome to tonight's Second Act Summer event. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Natalie Samardzian, who currently serves as a UCLA Alumni Association Board Director. Natalie is a double Bruin who graduated undergrad in 2006 and later earned her JD in 2012. Natalie.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, Bruin community. Welcome to tonight's Second Act event, Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. The second act started in the fall of 2016. It's designed to offer our Bruin community of folks in their fifth decade of life and beyond opportunities and resources to engage, learn, optimize our health, volunteer, and invest in themselves. Many of the topics that we share are ones that you suggest, so please continue to let us know what you're interested in learning more about. We want to thank our proud partner, Westcom Credit Union, for their support of the second act and the UCLA Alumni Association. So excited to present our speaker for this evening. I think you are all in for a real treat. And I'd like to start by introducing Professor Hal Hershfield. Professor Hershfield is a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. Professor Hershfield's research concentrates on psychology of long-term decision-making and how time affects people's lives. His book, Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today, which I hope you will all go out and get, is based on over a decade of groundbreaking research and explains how many of us view the future as incredibly distant, making us sort of more likely to opt for immediate gratification that disregards the health and well-being of ourselves in years to come. How resonant is that for so many of us? I know that it was for me as I was going through the book. Your Future Self presents the science, describes the mental mistakes we make in thinking about the future, and gives us really practical advice to help establish a stronger connection with our future selves and to make more well-informed choices for our own second act. I'm also excited to share some news from today. Professor Hershfield was featured today in the New York Times Well newsletter, which compiles essential news and guidance for us to live our healthiest life. The article, titled "Dreading That Event You Said Yes to Ages Ago, Be Kinder to Your Future Self," explores Dr. Hershfield's research into the phenomena of our tendency to agree to things that we don't want to do because we tend to hold a more aspirational version of our future selves. We like to think we have more time, interests, and generosity than we actually do, which sort of I felt like, wow, I feel very seen with this, and I'm sure many of you all do as well. Well, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Hershfield, our speaker for today.
Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate that. I'm glad that you feel seen. I feel like it's a common thing I feel as well. And thank you to all of you who are here tonight on a nice summer evening. So yeah, I'm Professor Hershfield. I've been at UCLA. This is the start of my 10th year, actually. And I couldn't be happier to be here. And I was very excited at the opportunity to speak to the alumni group. My mother-in-law is actually an alumni, though I don't think she's on this one. So I was really lucky that I had the opportunity to write this book, and I, felt supported in doing so, of course, by UCLA. And the plan for tonight, I was hoping I could talk a little bit about the research behind the book and about the book itself, sort of just high level. And then, of course, Natalie will jump in and we can, do some Q&A. When I did the research for the book, I'm a social scientist, so much of my research is on, big data sets and large populations, and then in writing the book, I realized, it's so much more interesting to talk to individual people and have stories. And one of my favorite, interviews that came about, one of my favorite stories is from a guy named Greg Tietz. He was actually an entrepreneur back in the 90s, living in the Midwest, and he decided to make a change in his life. He moves out to the Bay Area. He moves to San Francisco. And he's working as a bouncer and an events planner and a bartender at this one club, Bottom of the Hill. I don't know how many folks are in San Francisco. I used to live there. And it's this like classic music venue. And he would stay up super late at night. And then one day a week, he would have a day off and he would sort of explore the city. And on one of these days, he found himself in the Mission, which is like this little neighborhood where there's a lot of Mexican restaurants and there's these little burrito shops. And he's walking around. And I should say that around this time, he had this desire to get a tattoo. He hadn't had a tattoo. He wanted to get a tattoo. And so he's walking around the Mission and he walks by this one little burrito shop and there's the logo of the restaurant. And the logo is this like boy with like kind of a big hat on a corncob rocket ship taking off into space. And there's this sign next to the logo and it says, tattoo me on your body and get free food for the rest of your life. Now, I heard about this and like, I don't know how many of you would feel the same way. I heard about that and I was like, I would probably keep walking, but Greg is different than me. And he was like, this is amazing. This is it. This is my tattoo. So of course, the first thing he does is goes and he tries a burrito. He's like, this is great. I like it. And the next day he gets the tattoo. And for the rest of his life or for the rest of the restaurant's life, he was able to get free food from this restaurant. Now I spotlight this story in part because when I first heard it, I thought, and you can call me square, but I thought like, oh man, that could be a regrettable decision. Like, am I going to want that on my arm forever? Am I going to like those burritos forever? Wouldn't I want to go to a different restaurant? And will I feel stuck by this one? And so on and so on. And so I thought this could represent, and I will come back to Greg in a minute, but I thought this could represent a case where we make what I call a time traveling mistake, where we do something now that will have an impact on us later, but we make the decision in a way that could be unfair to our future selves. Now, in this particular case, the sort of mistake that I'm talking about is where we take our present day interests and we project them onto a future self who may not have the same interests as the person that we are right now. And I should probably say, the data suggests that most tattoos are not regrettable. Most people who get a tattoo don't regret it. The only times that they do is when it's like the name of an ex-lover or if the image sort of like changes shape over time. But in this particular case, I thought this could be one of these mistakes. And those are the sorts of mistakes that I've studied over the span of my career. So I look at cases where people say that they want to do something, but then fall short of it. So sort of the classic example is financial decisions. You know, people say I want to spend less and save more, but I have a hard time doing so. And there's health decisions. You know, I want to exercise more, but I have a hard time doing so. But those are sort of the like easy to point to examples. But there's other ones, especially ones that I think appear a little bit more as we travel through the life course, where I say I want to spend my time a certain way, but then I find myself having a hard time doing so. I sort of focus too much on the present, and then I look up and I'm not spending my time in ways that are as meaningful maybe to my future self. And so when I first started looking into these problems, it was back when I was in graduate school. And I was sort of influenced by the financial crisis of 2008. And I was looking at, why do people have this hard time making these decisions? And of course, there's all sorts of sort of situational factors, but why do people get so taken into the present moment? And so many economists look at sort of the nature of the decision itself. What are the features of, interest rates? What are the features of compound interest? What are the features of the decision? And as a psychologist, I took a slightly different perspective, which is that if we want to know something about the ways that people decide about the long term, rather than knowing about the decisions themselves, we should know something about the way people think of themselves over time. And that got me down this path of looking at what psychologists and philosophers call personal identity. The basic idea is, that, well, if I were to ask you, are you the same person now as you were when you were a kid? Or are you the same person now as you were when you were 30? It's a slightly strange question. And the answer can be complicated. And you say, yeah. In some ways, I'm basically the same. And then you start to think about it and you realize, well, I live in a different place and my interests are a little different and maybe my career is different. And before too long, you can realize that maybe I'm not necessarily the same person. And to grapple with that, what philosophers have suggested is that rather than sort of one person over time, maybe a better analogy is that we are a collection of separate people over time. And you'll see why that's important in a minute, but the data on this is actually pretty good. There's this one study that asked, this is an older study, and I love it because it asked college students to describe a meal that they were eating, that they would be eating like later that day. And, so people write down what the meal looks like. And then they ask a different group of college students, write down a meal that you would have in the very distant future. And it turns out for most college students, very distant future is 40 and over. That's just like, I can't even begin to think about that period of time if you're in college. So there's this interesting thing that happens. When people write about the meal that's happening right now, they're talk about the food, they see the scene in front of them. When they do this same exercise for the very distant future, all the features of the meal are there, but now people are more often or more likely to adopt the third person perspective. They see their future self as if it's another person in that scene. In other words, like in the mind's eye, our future selves are other people. People are actually likely to say, he is eating the meal now. I mean, wouldn't that be a weird thing to say about myself later today? But in 40 years, yeah, I picture him, he's eating this meal. Maybe not all of us do this, but we have this tendency to do that. My own research has backed this up. I've used neuroscience, neuroimaging research, and shown that in the brain activity that comes about when we think of our future selves looks more like the activity that comes about when we think of other people. When I first found that, and when other researchers have found something similar, it struck me as like a really, really interesting phenomena that here we are, sort of this, one self, if you will, but our future selves seem like different people. All right. So why is that important, or why is that interesting? If you start to think about the decisions we make on an everyday basis, the decisions about spending or saving or exercising or not, or how to allocate our time or who to spend it with. So often there are these decisions that have this moment in time right now, and then a consequence later. Well, now let's start thinking about this. If our future self is somewhat like a different person, well, now I can start to understand a little bit about how I make these sorts of decisions. One way to think about this is to consider how you treat other people in your lives. So, we all have sort of a range of people in our lives, right? There's everybody from our closest friends and our kids and spouses and our parents and adult children and so on and so on. Those are the closest people, all the way to strangers on the street or someone I might know in my neighborhood or community or workplace where I know they exist, but I know very little about them. Well, think about it this way. If one of those people, the people that we're not really that close to, if one of them, like your coworker or a neighbor, like on the other side of town, like you've seen them in the store or something like this, you see them occasionally, but you don't know anything about them. If they were to ask you to help them out this weekend with something, I've got to move some stuff out of a storage unit, can you help me? First off, it would be a strange request. And even if they did go through with the request, my bet is that you would find a reason not to do it. Not that you're a bad person, or maybe I should just speak to myself. Like I have a million other things to do at home. And like, if some like sort of distant acquaintance asked me to do something, like, I don't know, I think I'd find other reasons to say no. Well, the reason this is important is because if that's how we see our future selves, if our future selves are like these distant strangers to us, then all of a sudden it starts making sense why we might not do things for their benefit, or rather why we might almost over prioritize the present instead of doing things for them. Now, there's a sort of catch here, which is that not everybody in our lives is like that sort of stranger, right? I said earlier that we have these close relationships. We have our spouses and our kids and the neighbors who we love. And if one of them asked us to do something this weekend to help them out, you would probably find a way to make it happen. And so if we see our future selves in that way, if they look more like the other person, but another person who we have sort of a shared sense of connection to, then I think we're going to be more likely to do things for their benefit. So the gist, and like where I start the book, it's all about the idea that our future selves are seen as other people, but they're other people with whom we can share a closer or more distant connection. Now, over the years, my research has looked into this. So we've found that people who have more of a close sense of connection to their future selves, and by the way, how do you even measure that? We've devised all sorts of ways to do it, from neuroimaging to little questionnaires where you give people a picture and there's circles that go from not overlapping all the way to overlapping. And we say, pick the group of circles that represents how you think of your future self, how similar you are to your future self. Turns out that's a really easy thing for people to answer. And the people who have more of a sense of connection, more of a sense of sort of emotional bondedness with their future selves, they're more likely to have accrued assets. They're more likely to make healthy choices. They're even more likely to take the ethical path when they're given an opportunity to act unethically. Because again, that's another arena where there's a short-term reward, but also a possible punishment in the future in this particular case. We've even found that, by the way, that people who are more connected to their future selves end up being more satisfied with their lives, and they experience more meaning in their lives. So this is one thing to document this, but then the sort of other big question here is, well, how can we actually make those future selves more of a friend? How can we sort of make that future self more of a sense of like a close connection? So in the book, I talk about like a variety of different ways to do this. One of them is to simply try to make the future self feel closer. In other words, like enhance the sort of the relationship that we have with that future self. That sounds like a strange thing, but relationship experts have been doing this for decades. There's like these amazing tools to enhance closeness between two people. Art Aaron, by the way, if you're curious about this is a totally separate topic, but if you look up the 36 questions that can I think create love or something like this, it's a series of questions that one partner can ask to another, can be even perfect strangers, that create a stronger emotional bond between them. So it's not crazy to make people closer. All right, but how do you do that for the future self? So one strategy is to try to adopt the same lessons that charities have adopted. So what do charities do? If charities are going to try to get you to donate, they could give you a list of statistics, or they could show you a picture or tell a story. We know that these are the sorts of things that are more emotional. So one thing that my colleagues and I and students and I have tried to do is to try to make the future self more vivid and more emotional. We've played around with age progression technology, which basically mimics the age process, right? I probably don't need to describe this, but it makes your hair thinner and grayer and adds age spots and your ears bigger and all these things. And I've played around with this myself. My wife thinks that this software is forgiving. She thinks I won't have as much hair in the future as the software has told me I will have, but regardless, we have played around with this. So when we first started using this, it was really in its infancy. We put people into virtual reality environments and we had them walk around a room. They would come face to face with a virtual mirror, and in that mirror was their future self, and they would have a conversation, or another group of people would see their current self. And we found that the people who are exposed to these future selves end up being more motivated to save for the future. In other research, we've done the same sort of study, but with tens of thousands of banking customers, and found that the half of them who are exposed to their future selves are more likely to make a contribution to their long-term savings accounts. Now that's just one strategy. And then in the book, I talk about a lot of other ones, but the gist behind this, it's not about the aging per se, but it's about making the future self more vivid. What are the stories we can tell? What are the conversations we can have with that future self? What can I think about to make it more concrete and therefore emotional so that I take some action? Now that's one bucket. There's a couple of other buckets that I've looked at. Another one is to recognize that anytime we're making decisions between now and later, there's inherently a tension that exists because the person who has to sacrifice is my present self. Like, I'm the one who has to spend less in order to save more. I'm the one who has to eat the salad instead of the steak. And in a way, that's kind of like being in a bad relationship, like where you're with a partner and you're the one who's always sacrificing. Nobody wants to stay in that relationship. So one of the strategies that we've been devising is to try to figure out how to make the present day, quote unquote, sacrifices feel easier to undertake. So I'll give you one example. My collaborators, these are some UCLA collaborators. We worked with Acorns, which is a fintech financial technology company in Southern California. It's an app that's designed mostly for people who are trying to save money. And when people signed up, they were given the opportunity to set up an automatic savings plan. Basically, do you want money to be taken out at some regular pace? Now, we did something a little tricky, which is that one group was asked, do you want to save $150 a month? And then another group was asked, and these are thousands of people, do you want to save $5 a day? Now, I know it's like, 6:30 on the West Coast. So it's nobody wants to, think about math right now, but most of you probably can figure out like, those are the same exact amounts of money. And what we find is that even though they're the same exact amounts of money, $5 a day feels psychologically easier. It feels like a sacrifice that's not that hard to make because a lot of people say, there's tons of things that I spend $5 a day on, roughly speaking. I'm sure I could give up one of those. There's not as many things that I spend $150 a month on. I don't know if I could give up one of those. And sure enough, we find that 4 times as many people sign up when it's $5 a day. 30% sign up as $5 a day compared to about 7% when it's framed as $150 a month. So that's just like one of the techniques. And I sort of go in the book, I go into a lot of more depth about what are the other ways that we can make the present feel easier and when should we sort of lean in and celebrate the present, also in an effort to make life better for the future self. So, okay, so I know I'm going to turn it back to Natalie in a minute, but actually, wait, I wanted to talk about, hopefully it's okay if I can come back. I'll come back to Greg, the guy with the tattoo. So when I was desperately trying to reach out to him because I really wanted to ask him if he regretted getting that tattoo. No, at the same time, when I was working on the book, I was trying to reach out to a bunch of different people to talk to them because I figured somebody would have something interesting to say. And one of the other people I reached out to was this guy named BJ Miller. He's this incredible palliative care doctor in San Francisco. He's just this magnetic, compassionate, empathetic palliative care doctor there's this amazing New York Times profile of him about one man's quest to change the way that we die. And his whole effort is to make people think differently about the end of their lives. And I wanted to talk to him because I thought, man, if there's somebody who knows something about long-term planning, it would be him. And so I asked him, what do you see when things go really well? And he said, well, actually, let me tell you what happens when plans go wrong. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. I thought he was going to say when people don't make a plan. And that's not at all what he said. He said, plans go wrong when people make a plan and then they're somehow surprised that things end up differently than they had expected, especially as they get to the end of their lives. And I was like, all right, well, when does it go right? And he said, well, it goes right. And this was his quote. He said, when people hold a mature view of time, when they recognize that they can plan for the future, but that their plans can change as their feelings about the future change and as their feelings about life in general changes. And he said, those are the wisest patients. And I thought that made so much sense. And so it was like around this time I'm talking to him, and then I actually get a message from Greg, the guy with the tattoo. And I was like, oh my God, I got to talk to him too. And my first question to him, he's the nicest guy, and he's in his 50s now. And my first question to him was like, okay, Greg, how many tattoos do you have? I thought like maybe this was like the first of many, and he's like covered in tattoos now. And he was like, all right, guess how many I have? And I was like, I don't know, 35? And he was like, I have one. It was the tattoo from the restaurant. And so I asked him, I was like, do you regret it? Because as it turns out, the restaurant closed. A Greek restaurant took over and they honored the deal, but he didn't really like Greek food. So he stopped eating it. And so I said, do you regret it? And he said, not for an instant. And I was like, okay, tell me more about this. And he said, my life is so different now than it was then. He's like works in the corporate world. He can't stay up till all hours of the night, like at a music venue and at the bottom of the hill. He doesn't eat like, huge burritos multiple days a week. But he said, when I look at the tattoo on my arm, he said it instantly transports me back to that time and that person I was. And the way he said it was basically like, there are aspects of him that have sort of remained, even if his life is different. And one of the things I loved about this was that it struck me that his perspective was very similar to those like wise patients, right? From his perspective, he knows that he's changed from the past to the present. And in talking to him, and it was clear that he also appreciates that he will continue to change from now to later. So I think if there's, one other strategy that can be deployed when we think about making life better for our future selves and befriending them, it's the recognition that our future selves aren't these sort of static beings, but that they change just like we change, just like the best relationships have two, or multiple partners who change over time. And that's okay, because if we sort of assumed that our friends or partners would stay the same, we would be surely surprised when that wasn't the case. And so I think if we can find a way to treat our future selves that same way, it'll benefit us. Okay, so I think I want to stop there. Natalie, I can bring you back in, but thank you so much for your attention so far. I really appreciate it.
Professor Hershfield, that was so insightful. And
Thanks.
I'm sure all of you, like me, are just really kind of metabolizing so much insight. Thank you so much for that. I present on negotiation workshops centering women in leadership. We often talk about thinking about our future selves as an opportunity to give us courage to engage in negotiation. And I think, what you just shared gave sort of that element of the work so much more kind of context for me. So thank you. And I'm so fascinated also by the concept of virtual reality as an opportunity and the other strategies that you shared to build deeper empathy with our self. So many nuggets that I'm chewing on. I'm sure the rest of you are as well. I do want to encourage everybody to please submit your questions. I have a few that have already been submitted that we'll go through, but please keep them coming, and I'll make sure to present the question that you asked. So to start off, your book not only looks at the future self, but also offers some guidance for thinking about our past. Can you tell us a bit about how to connect with our past and how that may inform our relationship with our future self?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So there's some fascinating research about past selves. We play really funny tricks on ourselves when we think of our past selves, because we can at once put them. So if I think about something that I did 20 years ago that's deeply embarrassing, I can say, you know what, that's not really me. That is a very distant, that's like a very young and immature version of me. But if I think of something I'm proud of from 20 years ago, an athletic accomplishment or a professional one, well, now all of a sudden, yeah, that's me. That's really like, I think of that person as being very close to me. So we have this sort of like fuzzy relationship with our past selves and the way that we see those past selves. Now your question is about connecting with them. And that's not an area of research that I've done per se, but there's actually some really interesting work on, thinking about regret. And actually, if anyone's curious, Dan Pink has a great book called, the title is The Power of Regret, I think. But the gist is that, we often sort of lead our lives saying like, oh, regret is a bad thing. I don't want to regret something. But in a way, if we actually sort of communicate more with our past selves and think about those actions that we regret, it can be a catalyst for change, and it can actually help us not repeat the same mistakes, do better, get some insight into them, and so on. But in terms of connecting with those past selves, one strategy that may be useful is to consider the values and the sort of core traits that we hold close to ourselves, and think about which of those have remained relatively unwavering over time, because those are probably the things that are like really at our core, that in a way, if we want, those are the things that we can work on to make sure that they stay relatively stable over time moving into the future as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was fascinated. I did read Dan Pink's work, and it really resonated. Said the number one thing across the board that people regretted was not studying abroad. So here in our UCLA family, I wonder how many of you actually shared that regret. Thank you for sharing that. Next question I have here is, how does optimism bias, sort of defined as the cognitive bias that causes people to believe that they themselves are less likely to experience a negative event, how does that shape our decision making and our future thinking?
Right. I have a colleague who's one of the experts on optimism bias, Tali Sherratt, and we were on a panel together once, and she said, optimism bias is the realization that, pardon my language, but the realization that the shit can hit the fan, it just won't hit my fan. And I think that is such a good description of the optimism bias. Now, how does that shape our decision making? It's really straightforward. The way that it shapes our decision making is that even though we are aware that negative things can happen to us, we don't fully prepare for them because we're overconfident in thinking that they won't happen to us. So, one sort of classic area where you see this is with insurance, or with plan making, right? So, one of the common answers you get to the whole retirement crisis is, well, I'll just keep working. And that's great so long as you don't suffer a health event or some sort of change in the workplace or whatnot. And sometimes that is the solution, and that's not always the worst thing, right? I think we're finding that retirement doesn't look like the way it did, of course, before. But the optimism bias can sort of lead us astray because we don't fully plan, because we sort of don't want to see the possible downside of things.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely true, and that actually leads me into this next question that really sort of touches on sort of retirement, for someone who is still employed working in their second act for our sort of program today, for a number of reasons, but especially because they need the money. Is it too late to start a new retirement plan?
Yeah, no. So it's interesting because when I first started doing my research, I was really focused on the sort of accumulation side of savings, right? So, that's what researchers call it, accumulation, but it's really just like, how do I get someone to save? And that's a question that's really important when you're in your 20s, 30s, even early 40s. And as I've gotten older and as the field has matured, I've become much more interested in these decisions that happen closer to retirement and in retirement. And my perspective on this is that I don't want to sound like those signs that were in my first grade classroom, it's never too late to learn to read, but I also think that it's never too late. There's this there's this saying that a lot of researchers have pointed to, this old saying of, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is now. And the meaning behind that, of course, is that even if it seems late, of course, I think there's still opportunity for growth and there's still opportunity for changes. I also, by the way, when I was in grad school, my mentor is sort of an expert in retirement and aging and decision making. And I got to work a lot with folks who were looking at the space of sort of like of second career acts, and the fact that so many people now don't experience a traditional retirement, but rather do something different that may still bring in income, but may look very different from the earlier career. And I think there's something that's almost affirming about that, because it suggests that we can, that we can do something different. And if anyone's interested, Laura Carstensen, that was my graduate mentor, and she has done some really important sort of policy work on what are the jobs and career paths and roles that are most relevant for an aging workforce, which I think that's sort of like the next big societal question, because as you try to see like, well, how do I fit everybody in? That's one question you'd want to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a question that just came in now from Phyllis, and Phyllis asks, on a very simplistic level, doesn't this all basically boil down to sort of the age-old problem of the concept of delayed gratification and our struggle, I think, as a species with delayed gratification? Is it really that simple?
Right. So it's not that simple. It's interesting because there's been so much work over the years about delayed gratification. I'm sure many people on this call have heard of the marshmallow experiment. And if you haven't, it's this, old study that was done where kids were given the opportunity to have one marshmallow or wait 15 minutes for two. And then the researchers find that the kids who wait longer do better in life with their SATs and their income and so on and so on. But it turns out that's actually not. Actually, one of my colleagues at Anderson recently has found that it's not so simple. Turns out the kids who are good at waiting were the kids who came from more stable socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were basically socialized to learn that they could wait for something. Now, my own research really sort of interfaces with that. Of course, there is this tendency to want the sure bet right now and not wait for the bigger reward that would come later, delayed gratification. But what scientists and practitioners and policymakers, what they've grappled with over time is what predicts that and how can we actually intervene there? So where the work that I spotlight in my own research and in the book, it's all about figuring out sort of the step before delayed gratification. How can we figure out who is going to have an easier time waiting and being patient, and who's going to have a harder time, and how we can step in and help? And what are the arenas where I may be more patient here, but less patient there? And that's sort of that's the way I see this work sort of interfacing with that like classic notion of delayed gratification. Hopefully that helps, Phyllis. I think it's a really good question though.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we have another question that sort of wants to explore the opposite. So, we discussed the problem of how people settle for, gratification and, instant gratification preferred without fully considering the future self, and a struggle to find balance in this aspect. But what about the opposite problem? People who are so focused on the future that they are neglectful of the present.
I love this question. So, so much of my work focuses on what researchers call myopia. We have, myopic vision, we're tunnel vision. We focus right on the right, on the present, whatever's happening right now. There is this whole other problem known as hyperopia, where we almost miss the present for the future. So, I think the question was too much right now in early retirement for our future selves, right? And so there's this interesting problem, and you could hear this and say, well, that's not me, like I don't do that. But I think all of us to some extent have been guilty of this too much focus on the future. Like if you've ever had a gift certificate, have you ever had this happen where you get a gift certificate to a restaurant and you wait for the perfect time to use it, and then the restaurant closes and you're left with this worthless piece of paper, right? And that is, it's like you're waiting so long because you want it to be just right for that future self, and then ironically, you do a disservice to that future self, in the same way that if we sometimes are too focused on the future with retirement planning or whatnot, we may end up missing out on something right now. So the question is about balance. I should, as a preview, this is like how I close the book. And this is one of the most fun parts the most fun I had writing the book was thinking about that balance. I actually, after writing the book, heard a term that I thought was more relevant, which is harmony, which is the idea that balance is sort of like going back and forth, and harmony is like the two can coexist. I can have my present self's interests, I can have my future self interests as well. If you were to push me and say, what's the right balance? I do think the balance should be tipped in favor of the present self. The present self is the one who's living. We're the ones we're living right now, we're experiencing right now. So if we were only, living toward the future, the irony is that we may end up in the future with not as many good memories to look back on because we were so focused on not spending, or, and a lot of financial advisors talk about this, where they have retirees who have saved, and then all of a sudden they have to spend, and they're like, no, I don't want to. And then what's the point? You're sort of missing out. I know that's a specific problem. But I think if there's a balance or a harmony, the sort of equation should be one in where we are doing the things that celebrate the present so we can create experiences and memories that our future self looks back on. But at the same time, if we always do that, if every time Taylor Swift comes to town, we go to see her, then surely we are going to end up in a position that's worse in the future because we've sort of splurged too much. And I don't mean just with finances, right? I mean with our time and our health and our energy and so on. Hopefully that helps with the balance question.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. That is so right on. And, I think often we tend to sort of fall on one side or the other. I think then the next question is very much sort of in this same kind of vein. It's sort of the future is unpredictable. Financial, family, societal upsets can occur. We just spent the last 3 years experiencing a pandemic that many of us didn't know we could experience. And so, the person who submitted this question asked, what tips do you have for shifting, rebuilding after these unexpected events, and any tips for maintaining the balance of focusing on the pressing matters of the present while planning for an unguaranteed future? And you discussed harmony, maybe digging a little bit deeper into that. So what are some tactics and strategies to stay grounded in harmony?
Yeah. So, okay. So there's a couple of things here. So one is, this isn't concrete yet, but I do think, in writing the book, one of the people I talked to was the director of the Long Now Foundation, which is like a long-termism foundation. They really focus on the very long term. And, in my conversation with him, one of the things that we talked about was how oftentimes we face these like really uncertain futures. It seems like right now, this is, the time period we came out of is unprecedented, of course. And, I think many folks can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as a time when people similarly felt like everything is in flux and it's really uncertain. And at the same time, if you sort of, ignore the future because it's so uncertain, then the sort of present day problems become even sort of more pernicious and they take greater root, right? So you start thinking about the societal and personal problems that we have right now, which of those would be lessened had we paid more attention to them in the past? And then you start saying, which little problems right now are we not attending to because they're quote unquote little, but which of those will sort of mushroom into something much bigger in the future? Okay, so you wanted to get practical with this sort of, balance, if you will, right? So, I mean, one of the strategies that I really like on a personal level is to take a step back. And I like the idea, this is going to sound very like Southern California of me, but have a conversation with your future self. So in other words, I love the exercise of writing a letter to your future self and writing a letter back from your future self. And the reason that I think this is good is because I think it can help highlight what some of the values might be that we hold constant over time, and then use those values to gain some insight into the problems and barriers that we're facing right now, and say, which of these things seem more like a problem, but it turns out it's not really that central to my core, and which of them could end up being problematic for the sort of core identity that I hold near and dear. And maybe those are the things that I should start to try to tackle in different ways. Now, I don't know if this is, if this is almost getting too practical, but I'll give like one sort of final thing. And I know there's other questions here, but in terms of actually taking action, one of the best pieces of advice that I've, sort of learned from the research literature is adopting what's known as implementation intentions. And the idea behind an implementation intention is that it's not enough to plan. It's not enough to say, I'll do this thing, but to get as specific as possible. And I mean, and I know I'm going like really concrete and low level practical here, but hopefully this is
I think
relevant.
it'll be appreciated. Yeah.
But literally to say, not that I'm going to, for instance, not that I'm going to start exercising next week, because next week will never come, right? But literally how many different ways can I break that bigger category down into smaller actions? Like the very first one would be, maybe I should get some new running shoes. Okay, so I'm going to put in my calendar that on Saturday at 11 a.m., I'm going to buy some new running shoes, and then on Monday, I'm going to just like, what if I just go for a 5-minute walk or 5-minute run? And it's like almost a joke. And then if I do it, well, what if I go for 5 minutes more? But the idea of sort of saying, what is the specific task that I'm going to do, and when am I going to do it? And by the way, if you tell somebody, that can also really, really help, because it holds you accountable. But I think those are some like very concrete steps that can be taken.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm going to take that into tomorrow as opposed to next week. So thank you for that. We have a question from Martha here. She asks, what are some other arenas where we can affect our future selves other than finance and health? I mean, I found it so compelling when you shared that we make more ethical decisions when we think about our future selves. So just sort of expanding, Martha wants to know where else.
So the ethical decisions are one arena, and that's one that I find really interesting, because the idea there is that if I'm faced with a possibly unethical action, I can get some short-term reward and the possibility of a long-term punishment. And we find when we connect people more to their future selves, they're more likely to actually go the more ethical path. This is also true by the negotiation. We've looked at this specifically in the negotiation context. We've also looked at these relationships with future selves in terms of psychological well-being. So one study, or this isn't a study that I did, but other researchers, this came out a couple months ago, found that people who connect to their future selves, and getting people to connect to their future selves, increases a sense of meaning in life. So not the sense that, I understand the meaning of life, but rather the sense that my life has more meaning and purpose. And the way that they do that in that research is really simple, but they ask people to think ahead and to think about 2 or 3 expected things that they can expect in the future, rather than 2 or 3 surprising things. And the beauty of that is that it sort of forces you to sort of almost stay grounded and constrained and say what will remain true over time. And we've also looked at sort of connecting the future selves with satisfaction in life, which is a little different than meaning. And then most recently, we're looking at this in sort of a broader way in terms of how we spend our time. Do we spend it doing sort of the important, bigger picture, meaningful tasks, or the more short-term but urgent tasks? And I think we all know this, both socially and professionally, it can be really easy to do the short-term, urgent, and almost miss the sort of bigger picture, important ones. And so that's another arena that we're looking in there.
Yeah. And we just got another fascinating question that came in. So I'm reading this as I'm absorbing it here. An anonymous sort of inquirer asks, if a particular characteristic of your present self is precious now, and you realize it will be lost to your future self, what advice do you have to prepare for this?
I love that question. I'm trying to make sure that I fully understand like the characteristic to our present self. But I'm going to answer it the way that I think it's being asked. And if I'm wrong, like you can always contact me later. But I'm actually engaged in a research project about this very thing, or what I think this thing is right now, with one of my colleagues at Anderson, where we're trying to lean into that idea that certain things that are true of the present self that are precious will be eventually lost, as a way to encourage behavior change and a way to encourage doing more of the, whatever the things are that are closest to that. So the specific example, okay, so when I have two little kids, and when our daughter was born, so this was like 7 or 8 years ago, when I guess when my wife was pregnant, one of my Anderson colleagues, who's I'll call him out by name, Eugene Caruso, he sort of has a dark sense of humor. And he came into my office, and I think it was right after she was born, or I don't remember what. And he said, you'll never know it, but one day will be the last day that you pick her up. I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. And at the same time, so I'm hopefully this is clear how I'm relating this to this idea that there are these aspects of the self that will be lost. On the one hand, you could say, oh, that's so dark and terrible. On the other hand, you could argue that it's a way to kind of hold on to those things, or at least be more sort of present and intentional when we're thinking about them. So my collaborator and I, Ali Lieberman, another Anderson professor, we are actually trying this out, and we've had some success so far. We're using messages around the idea that one day you won't be able to do this sort of thing. We're making it not so dark, but we're trying to highlight the idea that, like, even with exercise or social relationships, that there will be a time when it will be the last time that you do that sort of thing. And the language that we're using is, we're sort of making it a little bit softer than that, but I'm just trying to get to the point quickly. So I think if there's a short answer to this, I guess I've sort of blown past the short answer, but if I can make it shorter, rather than sort of fight that, I think one other strategy is to lean into it and then treat those aspects just like they are. I think the person said precious, and try to take advantage of them more, and sort of almost own them more.
I love that. And that is actually very relevant to my life. And I have a 4-month-old with severe wrist pain, but grounding it in, I will not be carrying him forever. Just makes this just a lot more tolerable, and the wrist pain sort of a little less of a problem. Thank you for sharing that. That is actually really, really helpful. We have just a few minutes left here, and I sort of want to close out with this more of an open-ended question for you to share with folks. What do you ultimately hope that folks will take away from your book?
Oh, it's a really good question. So when, it's funny, when I started working, several years ago, when I started working on the idea of the book, it was, I kind of went into it a little naively, of like, what I want people to do is to do more for their future selves so that they're happier later. And then, in the process of writing it and really thinking deeper about it, it became much clearer to me that the goal I really want is not so much that I want people to sort of like start living their lives more for the future, but rather start living in a way that sort of spreads out well-being over time, so that I am experiencing what I can experience right now, but also doing it in a way that allows for the opportunity to have well-being, happiness, satisfaction, whatever it is, in whatever form, later as well, and then sort of back and forth. And so, my hope is that the research that I and my colleagues have been doing, and the research that I spotlight in the book, I hope it sort of helps make that sort of conversation and that relationship between who we are now and who we will be. I hope it makes it clearer and a little bit stronger.
I love that. I love that. Spreading it out, and that really kind of encapsulates harmony in a way. Is sort of like, don't live so gluttonously in the present and too conservatively for the future, but sort of try to find this harmony. Thank you so much, Professor Hershfield, and thank you, Bruins, for joining us tonight. I hope you all look out for the article tomorrow in the New York Times,
Yeah.
and also grab Professor Hershfield's book and share it with your networks. This program was recorded, and we'll send you the link once it's posted to the UCLA Alumni YouTube channel. Again, thank you to our proud partner, Westcom Credit Union, for their support of the second act in the Alumni Association. Please continue continue to share topics with us that you want to hear about. This is really the second act is shaped by your contributions. Professor Hershfield, thank you. And where can folks sort of find you? Any social media links or anything that you want to share where folks can continue following your work?
Yeah, Natalie, by the way, thank you so much for moderating. You can feel free to reach out to me, whether it's on LinkedIn or Twitter. My webpage, I think, is halhershfield.com. And of course, you can email me as well. I love to hear from the alumni network. So thank you for including me in this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all, and good night, everybody, and go Bruins.